All right. We are going to continue on with item E, which is 4-9 in the packet, the history of Alaska's best available technology report approval. It is an action item, and it's Linda Swiss and Susan Harvey.
Good morning. It's me, Linda Swiss, again. You might remember me from yesterday afternoon, if you were awake. And I'm just going to introduce Susan Harvey. Susan has been a contractor with us for over 14 years, I think. Susan has a bachelor's degree in petroleum engineering as well as a master's degree in environmental engineering, and has worked for industry, the government, and has now been a consultant spanning to about 27 years. And best of all, she's been a commercial fisherman in Prince William Sound, so the sound obviously is very important to Susan as well. And I'm going to turn it over to Susan. She's going to talk about Alaska's best available technology requirements for the tankers and the terminal.
Well, good morning. Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here again and see so many people I haven't seen in a long time. So it's really been a joy this last day, getting caught up with everybody. So Linda and I are here to talk to you about best technology, and I just want to take a moment to talk about why that's important to you as a board. Many of you around the table, I see a few that have worked on these laws and regulations over the years and have participated in getting them in place. And so what we're going to talk about today is how are those laws and regulations that the board worked so hard with the agencies, getting them into place, how are they working? How are they working for you? And how are they a tool for you to improve both prevention and response? And what are the limits? And then what are maybe some improvements that could be made there? So that's what this presentation is about. And so to get you lined up to your board notebook, there's a paper in here that got produced on the history. It's in item number 4.9 in the board notebook. Looks about like this. And so that will be for your reference. And pretty much we're just walking through that today with a presentation. So if we're going kind of in chronological order if you're working through it and you want to look page by page as we're going through. And we're going to talk about the best technology law and regulation history, just to get everybody on the same plane. We're going to talk about some issues and concerns specific to Prince William Sound, because the best technology regulations apply to a lot of things in the state of Alaska, but we're going to try to narrow down and focus on what's important to you in the Sound. And we're going to do a little summary at the end. And then Linda is going to take over. There's a board action to approve the white paper. So talk to you about that. And then talk a little bit about next steps. So this goes way back to the 1980 time frame. And in 1980, the Alaska Best Technology Statute, so the statute's the law, said that oil spill plans, so you probably heard Linda talk a lot about C plans, so just everybody knows that a C plan, capital C, is a oil spill contingency plan, and everybody who works on them has shortened that up over the years because they call them C plans. And so not SEA, C plans, but contingency plans. So we're talking about contingency plans, and for Prince William Sound, that would be the tanker plan, the plan about how to prevent and clean up a spill, or the Valdez Marine Terminal plan, how to prevent and clean up a spill there at the terminal. And the law in 1980 said you must provide for the use of best available technology, but the law didn't really spell out how do you do that, how do you actually make that work. In 1994, after the spill, the statute got beefed up a tad bit more, and it said the oil spill plan, the contingency plan, must provide for the use by the applicant. So the applicant has to specify in their plan the best technology that's available at the time the plan was submitted or renewed. So what this did, the law said more specifically, when you come in as an applicant, so when Alyeska comes in and applies for a plan every 3 years at that time, now it's every 5 years, they have to say, well, what am I doing for prevention technology and response technology? But this is the law. And we'll talk a little bit about how that got converted into regulations. So we're going to talk today about how is best technology determined, what's the criteria for determining that, which prevention and response equipment is subject to a best technology review, and does the best technology review apply to an individual piece of equipment or a system as a whole? So does every piece of equipment have to work perfectly, or does the whole system as an entity have to work? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. So in 1997, the agency the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation took the law and converted it into regulations, because now we've got to have some standards and regulatory process so the devil's in the detail, how are we actually going to do this? So they expanded this in the regulation, and the regulation says that the technology used for oil discharge containment, storage, transfer, and cleanup will be considered best technology if the technology as a whole is appropriate and reliable to meet the response planning standard. So what does that mean? Basically, in a nutshell, it says your oil spill response cleanup equipment, it just needs to meet an appropriate and reliable standard. If you can clean up a worst-case discharge, the response planning standard, that's what that means. So worst-case spill, and it's appropriate and reliable, that's going to meet the best technology standard. So most of the oil spill response equipment in Prince William Sound was never held to maybe what some people had envisioned when the law was put together as the best technology available on the market worldwide. When it got converted to regulation, there was the words added that for appropriate and reliable standard. There was 4 exceptions to this for best technology. In 1997, the regulation said we're going to pull out 4 items in the response toolkit that are going to have to meet a higher standard. That's going to be communications, source control, trajectory analysis, where does the spill go, how do you do a computer trajectory analysis and predict where it's going to go, and then wildlife response. And those 4 items have to go through a more rigorous 8-step process, a best technology analysis, where you look at, is it best in use worldwide? Is it transferable to this operation? Is there increased benefit to putting it in place? What's the cost of the new technology? What's the age and condition? Is it compatible? Is it feasible? Does it provide a net environmental benefit? So how this would work is when the applicant comes in to do their oil spill plan, they have to look at communication, for example. So Alyeska SERVs would have to say, my communication systems are either, yes, they're the best technology in the world, worldwide, or we've identified new technology that we've examined these 8 criteria and we found something new and we're going to upgrade our system. And they do that once every 5 years for these same topics. In turn, you as a board, when you're reviewing these oil spill plans like Linda was talking about yesterday, you can go to the agency because these laws and regulations are there, and if you feel like the applicant didn't do a thorough enough analysis and you say, well, wait a second, there's a really great communication tool that I know about, I've read about in a scientific journal, or I'm aware of because I use it in my fishing business, and I'd like to bring that forward. That's something you can bring forward and bring to the agency and to work with Alyeska SERVs to get it installed, and the law and regulation provides you the background to do that and the tool to do that. Okay, so when we're comparing for response, for best available technology for response, I put together this little simple comparison table because I think the point in this historical paper is there is a difference about how best technology is done for different types of equipment. So on the left-hand side, we have a couple items we question about how is BAT determined. And then if you go to the middle column, we're looking at just skimmer, booms, and vessels. That's just all your main response equipment. And for BAT, we just have to, the applicant just has to show that they can meet the worst case discharge cleanup, that they can clean up the worst case spill. For communications, source control, trajectory analysis, and wildlife, they have to examine whether it's the best technology available in the world. So there's a difference in the way that's done. If you go to the next line down, when you're looking at the criteria for this determination, for most of the response equipment, you go to the middle column here, it just has to meet an appropriate and reliable standard. Again, for those 4 select items, you have to go through this more rigorous review. And then the last item is, what does the best technology apply to the individual equipment or the system as a whole? For most of the response equipment, the skimmers, booms, and vessels, the evaluation is done on the whole system. Does the whole system work together? For the others, they're looking at each individual piece of equipment, so a more precise analysis. So in terms of the appropriate and reliable standard for most of your response equipment, they resulted in very little improvement in the skimmers, booms, and vessels that were compelled by the BAT regulation. And that's not to say there weren't some improvements that were voluntarily done by Alaska Serves, but just compelled by the force of the law and the regulation, we haven't really seen much come from that. There were a number of significant voluntary improvements done by the Alaska Serves organization. We've seen current and ocean buster booming systems improvements. Roy's been talking to you about crucial skimmer technology improvements, better boom, better tracking buoys. But I think the distinction here that we're trying to make is what's being compelled by the laws and regulations that were put on the books versus what's being voluntarily done. In terms of oil spill prevention, so I'm going to shift gears now. We've been talking all about response, but there also is a technology standard for oil spill prevention items. And those, just to give you a few examples, I listed a few at the top of the page here. We're talking about escort vessels, tow lines, leak detection systems for your tanks at the terminal, overfill alarms on those big crude oil storage tanks, things like that. Well, there's a whole long list of things that have to be examined. Again, every time an oil spill plan comes in, the operator of the Valdez Marine Terminal would say, this is what's the best technology, and then Linda and her team looks at it and says whether they agree or not and gives some feedback to the agency. Again, there's a much more thorough 8-step analysis required for prevention. And so where has that got you over the years? In terms of prevention, lots of good improvements. We've got the tug escort system, improved leak detection technology, improved corrosion control, improved tank overfill controls, and improved maintenance practices, just to name a few. So that 8-step process seems to be delivering some results. Okay, so we're back to this table I just walked you through. And I only added one more column there to the right. The far right, you see prevention equipment. And again, we're looking at those last 2 columns, a more thorough analysis, and then just skimmer, booms, and vessels just meeting that appropriate and reliable standard, just for comparison. So the other thing that the regulations in 1997 did for best technology was said that the agency needed to sponsor a best technology conference every 5 years to examine both prevention and response equipment. And the purpose of the conference really is an efficiency idea, because they've got people all over the state, that have oil spill plans. You've got shippers and railroad companies, and you've got folks drilling wells. You've got oil storage tanks. So there's a lot of people who have an oil spill plan in the state and have this obligation to do best technology. So there's an efficiency where the agency can hold a conference and say, well, gee, I've got lots of people who have large tanks and storing fuel and crude oil. Let me look at overfill alarms, or let me look at leak detection systems, and the agency can look at it and identify some technologies without everybody having to do that as an efficiency. So the idea is that these conferences would be held to identify technology that could be considered by a number of people, and then each applicant would then use that data as a starting point. It might just be a starting point. They might have to work with a vendor, or they might have to go out and do research with their own engineering team or hire a specialist to come in to make sure it could work at their facility, but it at least gets them started in the right direction. So what's happened with that since 1997? Well, in 2004, there was a conference, and it examined some prevention items, leak detection, secondary containment systems, and then it examined 3 different response items: fast water booming, viscous oil pumping, and pipeline clamps, which all were helpful to your area. And then the next 3 conferences were all about pipelines. Pipeline pigging, pipeline leak detection, and then one specific to Arctic and cold region pipelines. And while there's been quite a bit done on pipelines and a little bit on prevention, when we look back at the years that this has been in place, for 17 years, there's been 3 types of response equipment that have been examined in terms of improvements for best technology. And that's a limited number in that length of period of time. So another thing that's happened with best technology, just to get everybody up to speed on the history, is in 2002 there was a Supreme Court challenge about how BAT was being administered, and the court challenge was filed by Tom Lakosh against the state of Alaska. And in that case, Mr. Lakosh argued that all oil spill response equipment should undergo that more thorough 8-step review, not an appropriate and reliable standard, and that might get more new technology installed. Well, the Supreme Court agreed with Tom Lakosh in 1997 and agreed that that regulation actually conflicted with the statute, that when the regulation was put in place, it didn't match up with what the statute was asking. And the Supreme Court declared the appropriate and reliable standard for oil spill response equipment to not be valid. So it got overturned. In the same year, a couple months later, in response to that Supreme Court decision, Alaska revised the statute. They went back and said, well, if the statute doesn't match the regulation, we'll fix the statute. So they revised the statute to provide the agency with discretion to decide which prevention and response equipment was subject to review and how it would be done. So the end result was no change, because the statute was changed to give flexibility, and the regulation stood that it just had to meet an appropriate and reliable standard again. So that standard still stands today. One other thing we've been noticing since 2004 to 2014, roughly that time frame, in the last decade, we've noticed a couple changes in also how the prevention BAT is being done. Although there's been no statutory, no law, or no regulatory change, there's just been some changes in how it's being administered by the agency. And one was what actions must be taken when, well, I take that back. There was a regulatory change, but I'll explain that here in a minute. What actions must be taken when you reach realistic maximum response operating limits, RMOL? You heard Roy talking about RMOL. We talk about RMOL a lot, but that's when you hit the worst of the worst, when it's, over 10-foot seas, 40-knot winds, and when mechanical response is ineffective. That's when you hit RMOL. So what do you got to do when you reach that? We'll talk more about that. And the other thing we noticed is about how the Prince William Sound Escort Tug Assessment is being completed and evaluated. So this is a little chart, and you see it in the paper, and we're just trying to give you a visual. On the left-hand side is green. It's the go situation. Mechanical response is working, operating conditions are working well, and equipment can be employed effectively. As you transition over into the yellow and the red, where we're kind of using a stoplight color coding system here, where conditions exceed RMOL and things that aren't working so well with mechanical equipment, the regulations had previously required that you would just use prevention measures. prevention measures could be employed. And so the more that you did in terms of improving prevention, you could expand your operating window. And so you really want to work hard to put technology in there to improve prevention to expand your operating window. What got changed in 2004 is we look at the same chart, but the one thing you'll notice is that, whoops, I hit the button too far here. Go back. Is that on the right-hand side, there is an addition of non-mechanical response. So in the case that you can't respond mechanically, you don't just have to prevent the spill anymore. The regulation was changed where you could supplement it with spraying dispersants or doing burning as an alternative, which would really do reduce that motivation to expand and do technology to improve that prevention window. So the other thing that we've seen, we'll go back to that same chart I keep showing you, and on that right side of this equation, we talked earlier in my presentation about the benefit of prevention equipment being evaluated on each individual piece of equipment, a really precise analysis. And we saw in the last decade a change in that. And particularly of particular interest to you, how the agency has been administering the tanker escort best available technology analysis. So in 1995 to 2001, the best technology analysis have always been focused on what's the best technology for each escort tug. So not just the whole system, is it working as a whole system, but let's, for example, the discussion that you had yesterday about the Hindenburg tug, is that best technology for that area? Is that tug the best tug for that area? Is it working correctly? Not just that the entire system is working effectively. So that was the way the analysis was done. But in 2007, what we saw is the agency transitioning to looking just at the system as a whole. So if the whole system worked, but not every part and piece was just working perfectly, but the whole system was okay, then that would be acceptable. And that prompted a legal review by the law firm of Walker and Levesque. Now it's Levesque Law Group, LLC. And Joe's here with us today, so he could probably speak to this if a question comes up. But Walker and Levesque did an analysis for the council on the legality of that. And, is it required for each tug or for the system as a whole? And your attorneys determined no, that the law requires each tug to be analyzed. In 2012, again, the agency reviewed the oil spill plan for the tankers and said that it was their determination. You just look at the system as the whole. And in 2013, the council hired naval architect Robert Allen, and Robert Allen advised you that there are improvements that are commercially available for the escort tug system, both as the whole and individually, that could be considered. But again, you got to get the agency to go back to that individual tug analysis to actually require them. So in summary, the key points here, just to recap, what we talked about is that most response equipment does not undergo this more rigorous standard. It only has to meet an appropriate and reliable standard. We also want to point out that while some voluntary improvements and some really good voluntary improvements have been done by Alaska Serves, they weren't really prompted by this BAT law and regulations. So there's a disconnect there as to why the laws and regulations on the book are not producing some of those results independently. And that the BAT process was generally working for prevention, but we've seen some changes in the way the agency's been interpreting it that are not so favorable. And in 2004, the regulation really is allowing dispersants, for example, to exchange for prevention, which is a change. And also, the last point was that we talked about the tugs being evaluated as a system and not individually. So some areas for consideration, are there things that need to be done for improving the response, how it's being evaluated? to really prompt some improvements, whether or not prevention should be applied at our mold and get back to where dispersants and burning may not be exchanged for prevention, and whether each escort tug should be evaluated individually. So those are some topics for the board to consider in the future. And the board action is to approve the white paper, and I'm going to turn this over to Linda.